What if one woman, in just 7 seconds of silence, exposed years of hidden abuse in a courtroom built to protect power? In a red blazer and with one small badge, Danielle Mercer didn't need to shout. She only had to sit. What happened next shocked everyone. Watch until the end to see how stillness shattered the system. Like, share, and subscribe for more real power stories that make silence speak louder than words. It began in under 10 seconds, just enough time for someone to stand or not. In the packed municipal courtroom of Grey Ridge, the weight of order sat on polished benches and creaked through wooden floorboards. On that morning, the air smelled of dust, coffee, and routine power. The kind of power no one questioned anymore. Until she didn't move. Danielle Mercer sat in the back row, her red blazer crisp, the fabric holding form like steel disguised as silk. She didn't speak. She didn't glance. She didn't blink more than necessary. In a space where everyone knew the unspoken rules, who rises when a uniform enters, who lowers their gaze, she simply stayed still. And in Grey Ridge, stillness was louder than defiance. Sergeant Caleb Rourke entered through the side door at exactly 9:02. One clack of his boot heel echoed like a starter's pistol. The courtroom responded with synchronized obedience. Papers shuffled away, feet straightened, eyes lifted. Everyone stood, even those who didn't know why anymore. Everyone. Except her. He noticed instantly. His eyes were trained for disruption like a hawk trained for prey. Rourke wasn't just an officer. He was a symbol. 20 years in uniform. 8 internal commendations. Never a single official complaint that stuck. He was the storm dressed as procedure, and people learned to avoid becoming his target. But today, Danielle Mercer didn't move. Rourke's steps shifted rhythm. Less routine, more deliberate. 1, 2, 3 sharp strikes across the oak floor, then a pause. His gaze narrowed, muscles tightening beneath the neatly pressed gray of his uniform. No words yet. Just a long stare that had cowed attorneys, defendants, even witnesses. But not her. Her chin remained level, eyes forward. Not on him. Not on anyone, as though she were waiting for something, or nothing. Then he spoke. "You think that seat is for you?" His voice cracked the silence like glass, shattering in a quiet church. Conversations died mid-sentence. One juror's pen froze above a notepad. A child clung tighter to their guardian's arm. The sentence wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a declaration of territory, a warning shot wrapped in official tone. But Danielle didn't answer, didn't look, didn't rise. Rourke stepped closer. One hand hovered above his belt, the other curled with tension. His face, usually unreadable, now contorted with something deeper than insult. Disbelief. Because she hadn't defied him, she had simply not acknowledged him. And that, to a man like him, was worse. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. Gasps scattered across the room like raindrops before thunder. Chairs shifted. A bailiff started to move, but froze halfway. There was no raised voice from Danielle, no scream, no protest. Just that same quiet posture, back straight, wrist now clutched in a grip too tight, too personal, too wrong. And still, she didn't flinch. Rourke's face tightened further, expecting resistance that didn't come. His grip was meant to provoke panic, to assert his control like a gavel strikes silence. But her calm became a mirror, reflecting something in him he didn't want to see. Fear. Not hers. His. In that heartbeat of stunned quiet, something shifted in the atmosphere. It wasn't just tension. It was revelation. Every officer in the room suddenly remembered their training manuals, remembered that physical contact without cause was breach. Every intern scribbling notes about legal process now stared wide-eyed at a living contradiction. A courtroom, supposedly ruled by law, was now in the grip of something primal. And still, she didn't react. No badge, no raised voice, no resistance. But her stillness rippled outward. She was no longer just a seated woman. She was now the eye of a storm that was just beginning to form. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone was quietly lifted. A record button pressed. That moment, no longer hidden behind courtroom hierarchy, had just been committed to memory. Rourke leaned down, his breath sharp, acidic with fury and disbelief. "Where's your ID?" he hissed, voice thin with barely contained rage. Still no answer. Just eyes, calm and still. Not arrogant, not passive, just watching, measuring. And that was what broke him. Not words, not resistance, not even accusation. Her silence, because Sergeant Caleb Rourke had never lost a room, not in 2 decades. He was the authority, the law, the unbending will of the courtroom itself. But this time, the energy had changed, and he wasn't the center of it. She was. Without saying a word, Danielle Mercer had made him feel what so many others had felt in his presence. Small, a low voice finally cut through the standoff. "We should wait for the judge," someone murmured. It was Deputy Lynn Mallory, Rourke's usual shadow. But her voice didn't carry its usual certainty. It sounded like retreat. He didn't let go right away. His grip lingered, trembling slightly. Around them, time had slowed. A child began to cry softly. The judge was late. No one dared move. Finally, with a sharp breath, Rourke released her wrist. Red marks already bloomed on her skin like a quiet accusation. But she didn't even glance down. She just sat, still and composed, as if the moment hadn't belonged to her at all, but to the room now being forced to confront itself. That's when the real story began. Not with a badge, not with a name, not with an outburst, but with a refusal to move. That day, the people of Grey Ridge would come to understand something that would ripple across agencies, classrooms, and boardrooms for years. Power doesn't always wear a uniform. Authority doesn't always shout, and justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it enters wearing a red blazer and says absolutely nothing. The moment Sergeant Caleb Rourke let go of Danielle Mercer's wrist, it wasn't relief that filled the room, it was a sharper, colder kind of silence, the kind that prickles just under the skin, where tension has passed the point of fear and entered revelation. The courtroom in Grey Ridge, so used to spectacle and intimidation dressed up as order, now sat in something unfamiliar. Stillness, without submission. And all of it centered around the woman who had done nothing except not move. But it wasn't over. Rourke had backed off, yes, but the unspoken rule in that courtroom was still hanging mid-air. He was the law. Or at least, he believed he was, and his pride wasn't going to let the moment go unanswered. He turned back toward her, jaw clenched, eyes narrowing, like a man stepping into a fight he didn't realize he'd already lost. His voice returned, but thinner now, like a wire fraying at the edges. "You don't belong here," he said. "This is a secure federal hearing. You have 10 seconds to provide credentials, or you'll be escorted out." A lesser person might have argued, might have raised their voice or tried to prove themselves, but Danielle didn't even blink at his threat. She simply reached, slowly and calmly, into the inside pocket of her red blazer. No haste, no panic. She moved like someone with time on her side. Then, in one motion, she placed a small leather folder on her lap. It lay there, closed, for a single beat of silence. And then, with quiet precision, she opened it. The Department of Federal Oversight badge gleamed under the courtroom lights. silver-etched, black-shielded, with the seal of the Internal Division that oversaw not just federal procedure, but those who enforced it. A level of jurisdiction rarely seen in public, and almost never questioned. The badge wasn't shown for drama. It was placed deliberately, like a chess piece that ends the game without moving again. Time fractured. No one spoke, not even Rourke. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to dim. A woman in the gallery dropped her pen. Someone near the front whispered, "Is that real?" But no one answered, not because they didn't know, but because they knew too well. That badge didn't belong to journalists or attorneys or even senior court officers. It belonged to people sent in when the system itself was suspected of failing. Danielle didn't say a word. She didn't raise the badge. She didn't point. She didn't need to. Its mere presence on her lap was declaration enough. Sergeant Rourke's reaction was barely contained. His expression twisted not just with anger, but confusion. The kind of confusion a man feels when the rules he thought he owned suddenly no longer apply. He took a step back, involuntarily, as if the badge had pushed him without touching him. This wasn't a disruption anymore. This was an investigation. Deputy Lynn Mallory, who had earlier whispered a warning, now visibly stepped to the side. One step, but enough to show distance. Not from Danielle, but from her own partner. The badge didn't just neutralize Rourke. It neutralized his allies. Danielle slowly folded the badge shut and returned it to her jacket. No gloating, no theatrics, just quiet conclusion. Her eyes, unreadable, lifted once briefly and scanned the room. It was the first time she'd looked up since arriving. It wasn't defiance, it was assessment. Every judge, officer, clerk, and observer in the room now felt what Rourke had felt a minute earlier. They were the ones being watched. The courtroom, designed to spotlight guilt, was now turned back on itself. The badge wasn't just identification, it was a mirror. No one asked why she was there. No one dared. Somewhere near the front, a paralegal began to reach for their phone again, not to record, but to scroll, looking for a news alert, a memo, anything to explain what was unfolding in front of them. There would be nothing. DFO operations didn't announce themselves. They didn't need permission. And they never walked into a courtroom unless something was already wrong. That was the moment the shift truly occurred. The center of gravity in the room moved from the judge's bench, from the defendant's box, even from Rourke's heavy boots. All authority now sat in the back row, on a wooden bench where no one had expected anything meaningful to happen. A place usually reserved for observers, for those without power, now held the epicenter of accountability. And it wasn't over. A clerk near the side door quietly stood, walked over to the judge's assistant, and whispered something in their ear. Paperwork was shuffled faster now. People who hadn't looked at Danielle once when she walked in were now afraid to glance at her for too long, because this wasn't just an unexpected federal presence. This was a warning. Not spoken. Not issued by subpoena. Not shouted through a megaphone. But clear all the same. Someone with authority beyond yours has been watching, for longer than you realized. Sergeant Rourke turned once more toward Danielle, but this time his stance was more uncertain. Less soldier, more suspect. He opened his mouth, perhaps to question, perhaps to justify. But she didn't look at him. Not anymore. That part of the story was finished. Instead, Danielle leaned slightly forward, opened the small black notebook in her lap, and began to write. Not as a statement, not as a message, just notes, observations. The kind that didn't need to be read aloud to change a room's memory. And the most dramatic part? No one stopped her. Because everyone in that room understood that whatever power they thought they had before she now had the final say. Later, the footage would be reviewed by oversight analysts. Voice recognition would confirm names. Wrist bruising would be noted as evidence. The incident would be filed, not as a mere outburst, but as the first documented escalation in a courthouse long suspected of quiet coercion. But for those who were there in real time, the most unforgettable part wasn't the grab, the threat, or even the release. It was that moment, just a few seconds long, when a badge appeared, time stopped, and everything people thought they understood about authority was rewritten, and the woman in red never had to say a word. When Danielle Mercer calmly placed the Department of Federal Oversight badge in full view, the room didn't just fall silent. It recalibrated. Every breath, every eye, every pulse shifted course. She had done what most couldn't dream of doing in a courtroom built to reward obedience and fear. But as the tension seemed to pause in stillness, a different kind of action was already underway. Quiet, subtle, and potentially more dangerous than any protest. From his corner of the room, tucked between the stenographer's bench and a stack of outdated case folders, Julian Reeve saw everything. He was 26 years old, a junior court clerk on his second year of rotation, still fresh enough to believe he could make a difference, but already weathered enough to feel the slow erosion of that hope. Until now, Julian had always admired authority. He grew up believing in uniforms, in salutes, in courtroom order. His father had served as a deputy in the same precinct where Sergeant Caleb Rourke made his name. Stories of Rourke's iron discipline were family folklore, lessons on structure, toughness, and knowing your place. Julian had once believed them all, but today that belief cracked. It didn't shatter in a sudden dramatic break. It split like wood under pressure, quietly, persistently. Because as he watched Rourke grip Danielle Mercer's wrist with unwarranted aggression, then backpedal the moment her badge appeared, Julian saw the truth that no training had prepared him for. Power without accountability is just performance. He didn't say anything. He didn't gasp like others. But his hand moved instinctively, down beneath the desk lip to the phone he always kept tucked beside the docket book. No hesitation, just a thumb swipe, camera icon, record. The angle wasn't perfect, and the lighting caught a glare off the brass light fixture above. But it didn't matter, because what he captured wasn't about clarity. It was about confirmation. Danielle Mercer had not disrupted order. She had exposed the illusion of it. Julian kept recording, silent and still, letting his phone do what the court had failed to do for years. Document the moments that justice refused to see. The lens framed more than just Danielle and Rourke. It caught the reactions, the judge's assistant, frozen mid-note, the security deputy shifting weight away from confrontation, the prosecutor subtly turning their case folder upside down as if hoping to hide under its pages. Fear disguised as protocol. Guilt masquerading as confusion. It was all there, on film, and Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He had seen too many files pass through his hands, transcripts missing timestamps, footage mysteriously corrupted, logs amended retroactively with clarifications. He had seen names disappear from the roster after filing complaints, had seen women, mostly black women, escorted out for breaking decorum, with nothing but a look or a question. But there was never any video, never any proof. Until now, this wasn't just a recording. This was a ledger, a crack in the marble facade, a preserved truth that could no longer be denied or revised. For the first time, silence didn't mean compliance. It meant recorded memory. Julian's heart pounded as the footage kept rolling. But he didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His duty now wasn't just clerical. It was moral. And the most ironic part? No one even noticed him. Because people like Julian, quiet, young, low-ranking, weren't seen as threats. That was their power. And today, he would use it. As Danielle slowly closed her badge case and returned it to her blazer, The courtroom began to breathe again, but differently. A subtle discomfort settled into the posture of every person there. Some looked away. Others kept their heads down. Not one dared meet her eyes. Julian caught all of it, because justice, he realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't wrapped in ceremony or echoed in the judge's gavel. It was a thing you caught in the act. It was body language. It was the moment Rourke hesitated, realizing he'd gone too far. It was the tremor in Deputy Mallory's hands as she fumbled a pen she hadn't dropped in over 10 years. Julian turned the camera slightly and caught the red mark still fading on Danielle's wrist. Subtle, temporary, but undeniable. The kind of injury that left no lasting scar, but burned itself into the conscience of everyone who saw it happen. And he knew. This footage would matter. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But one day, someone would need it. Someone would say, "Prove it." And now, he could. Julian didn't stop recording until Danielle opened her notebook and began writing. No show, no monologue, just notes, her version of observation, her version of control. And again, he caught the change in the room. Authority was no longer at the bench. It was on the page in her lap. The hearing had been scheduled for 90 minutes. They were only 18 minutes in. But already, everything had changed. Later that afternoon, Julian would upload the video to an encrypted drive. He would catalog it under the anonymized tag RedSeat01 and include a short memo for the internal oversight server. Incident involving federal badge presentation by unregistered DFO officer. Recorded interaction includes potential abuse of force and suppression of jurisdiction, awaiting further review. He wouldn't sign his name, not yet. But inside, something had already shifted forever. Julian Reeve was no longer the idealist clerk trying to impress superiors. He was a witness now. A documentarian of the truths no one else wanted to admit. And he knew there were more truths coming. Because if Danielle Mercer had appeared today without announcement, she wasn't alone. Someone had sent her, and someone else was watching. In the footage's final frame, Danielle closed her notebook, exhaled once, and looked up. Straight into the lens. It was as if she knew. The video landed in Mira Langston's inbox at 4:43 in the afternoon, 47 minutes after the hearing in Grey Ridge had been unexpectedly adjourned. No subject line, no signature, just a file named RedSeat01 and a one-line message. "You'll want to see this." Mira didn't hesitate. She clicked, expanded the footage to full screen, and hit play. What she saw didn't surprise her. It confirmed everything she had feared, and everything she had spent the last 3 years trying to prove. Danielle Mercer. Calm. Silent. Seated in the back row. Sergeant Caleb Rourke's hand clamping down like a trap. The slow reveal of the DFO badge. The red mark on her wrist. The sudden, collective realization rippling through the courtroom like a breached dam. Mira didn't even blink. She had seen variations of this moment before, heard the echoes of it in hushed interviews and second-hand whispers. But this was the first time she had actual visual proof. And that changed everything. For most people, it might have seemed like a shocking incident, a single moment of misconduct. But for Mira Langston, it was the missing keystone in a sprawling investigation built on shadows, silence, and systemic amnesia. Danielle's stand, or more accurately, her refusal to stand, was not an isolated act. It was the trigger Mira had been waiting for. The match to the fuse. The red blazer that finally made invisible harm visible. She watched the footage again. And again. 3 times in total. Each time cataloging expressions, timestamps, physical cues, the angles of avoidance. Then she opened her archive. An encrypted caseboard she had been building for 36 months under an internal audit initiative labeled Project Hollow Bench. At its heart was a disturbing question. Why were black women being quietly removed from courtrooms without cause and without record? What began as a single complaint from a junior analyst in Tulsa had evolved into a pattern. Mira had uncovered a dozen removals over the course of 2 years, all under similar circumstances. No video footage, no press. No written justifications beyond vague phrases like non-compliance or disruption. Most had no names attached, some weren't filed at all. But Danielle's incident? That one was documented, recorded, undeniable. Mira dragged the Red Seat 01 footage into a new subfolder and began cross-referencing courtroom schedules with internal log failures. The pattern surfaced quickly. Every incident had occurred on a Friday. Every subject was a black woman. Every courtroom camera had malfunctioned. She pulled up a heat map of surveillance downtimes. The data was damning. Every Friday, between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, camera feeds in Gray Ridge and 4 other districts showed unexplained connection losses. No maintenance logs, no reported outages, just gaps. And now she had a video to fill one of those gaps. Mira leaned back in her chair. To most of the world, she was a senior compliance officer with the Department of Federal Oversight. Polished. Impeccable. The kind of woman who carried a binder like a weapon. But under the surface, Mira was a system archaeologist. She didn't just enforce rules, she exhumed the rot buried beneath marble walls and cordial smiles. And she was done with silence. For months, her investigation had hit wall after wall. She'd been called excessively thorough, warned against dredging up ghosts, even subtly reassigned once, until she pushed back with legal citations sharp enough to leave bruises. Now, though? Now she had what no one expected her to get. Proof. Danielle Mercer hadn't just confronted a bully in uniform, she had cracked open a sealed vault. She had stepped into that courtroom like a scalpel, precisely aimed, precisely timed, delivering a cut deep enough to draw the truth into daylight. Mira opened a new case summary. Case name, Operation Red Seat. Incident date, Friday at 3:15 in the afternoon. Location, Gray Ridge Municipal Courtroom 2. Subject, Danielle Mercer. Federal Oversight Operative. Violation captured. Unlawful physical contact by Sergeant Caleb Rourke. Pattern identified. Targeted ejection of black women during Friday sessions. Absent documentation or judicial authority. Next step, expand scope. Pull logs from all Friday hearings in the past 30 months. Identify gaps. Isolate names. She didn't need permission. That's what the DFO existed for. And she wasn't stopping at one courtroom. Switching tabs to her timeline board, Mira made another note. Danielle's badge hadn't just been a shield, it was a signal. Mira would interview her off the record, but she already knew what the conversation would uncover. Danielle wasn't acting alone. This was bigger. A coordinated movement. A silent force embedded inside the system, forcing it to finally look itself in the mirror. This hadn't been accidental. Danielle had walked into that room not blind, but surgical, perfectly placed, perfectly timed. And Julian Reeve? His video wasn't just courageous, it was crucial. Mira quietly bookmarked his name. She would protect him. He didn't know it yet, but his footage might end up saving more than one case. His lens had caught what institutional habit had trained others to ignore. The system, Mira realized, wasn't broken. It had been trained to erase, and that made her mission all the more urgent. She reopened archived cases, Simone Archer, Marla Hensley, Thea Ross, all names previously buried beneath phrases like non-compliant demeanor or disrupted decorum. Each one quietly removed, unchallenged, forgotten. Now, thanks to Danielle's clip, they could be remembered. reinstated into the record, given voice. By 6:22 in the evening, Mira had already drafted a subpoena request tied to Sergeant Rourke's badge number. She marked it urgent and flagged it for the Internal Review Task Force. She didn't need an army, just the truth. And now the truth had a witness, a file name, a timestamp. In the quiet of her office, Mira looked at the frozen image on her screen. Danielle Mercer, seated, calm, her badge glinting beneath her red blazer. One act, one camera, one red blazer, and suddenly, what had been hidden for years was beginning to shine. Long after the lights in the Grey Ridge courtroom dimmed, and after Danielle Mercer's silent confrontation was reduced to a series of clipped phrases in preliminary incident reports, Mira Langston was still in her office. The fluorescent buzz overhead hummed like a second hand on a clock no one else could hear. But for Mira, the passage of time wasn't marked in hours. It was marked in names. Forgotten ones, erased ones, buried not beneath earth, but beneath bureaucracy. The Red Sea Talk Show 1 video had done more than confirm systemic courtroom abuse. It had resurrected a ghost, not a myth, not a rumor, but a name Mira hadn't spoken aloud in over 6 years, Simone Archer. It started when Mira zoomed in on the footage from Grey Ridge, not just on Danielle's face or Rourke's hand, but on the chair, that seemingly ordinary back row seat, a place meant for the silent, the unimportant, the invisible. She recognized it, the curvature of the back, the small, nearly invisible scratch on the lower right leg. She knew that chair, because she had once seen another woman sit in it. A woman who never made it to the witness stand. A woman named Simone. Simone Archer had been a decorated federal investigator. Sharp, unflinching, principled to the point of danger. 6 years earlier, she'd walked into a courthouse not to attend a hearing, but to report misconduct from inside the very agency she served. Mira had received the draft of her internal whistleblower complaint just 2 days before it was withdrawn under voluntary dismissal. The reason? Courtroom misconduct. Unfit behavior. Disruption of decorum. All boilerplate excuses, hollow as breath in winter. But Mira never believed the story. Not then. And certainly not now. Danielle Mercer sitting in that same chair was no coincidence. Mira opened her deep archive, a hidden segment of the DFO system she maintained herself. She searched for Simone's ID tag, ARS 04491B. No results. Not inactive, not suspended, gone. She checked alternate directories, then backup servers. Still nothing. Her file hadn't just been closed, it had been scrubbed. Vanished like a name never spoken. But Mira had kept a fragment. A single offloaded PDF from 6 years ago. Simone Archer's preliminary statement. 11 paragraphs. Descriptions of intimidation by courtroom officers. Mentions of unexplained ejections. The phrase, targeting of black female personnel during federal proceedings, appeared 5 times. Mira exhaled slowly. Danielle hadn't come to Grey Ridge just to witness. She had come to finish something Simone had started. Pulling up personnel rosters from that year, Mira began manually cross-referencing Simone's last known cases. 3 hearings, 1 internal complaint logged by a junior officer named Dennis Park, now retired. The pattern was there, almost screaming. Each hearing she had attended had resulted in some form of misconduct. Not by Simone, but against her. Each time she tried to speak, someone had pulled her back, shut the door, killed the mic. And now, 6 years later, another woman had taken her seat. Worn her red blazer. Lifted the badge she never got the chance to show. The history refused to stay buried. At 9:12 p.m., Mira sent a secure request to the Federal Clearance Archive asking for all data suppression logs from the week Simone Archer disappeared from the system. She marked the request with the highest clearance key she possessed. She didn't wait for permission. She forced it. Within 20 minutes, she received a partial ledger, heavily redacted, but not enough to hide everything. One entry stood out. Internal reassignment record redacted due to failure to conform with departmental culture. No name, no date, but the location listed was Grey Ridge. The same courtroom, the same bench. Mira stared at it. In her hands, she held something bigger than policy violation. This wasn't just a case of courtroom overreach. This was a cover-up that had crossed departments, spanned years, and buried a federal officer without even marking her absence as suspicious. She went deeper, into meeting notes, into HR audit records from the same fiscal quarter. She found a one-line mention. Officer reassigned indefinitely due to disruption of chain of command. No follow-up, no personnel file, not even a termination notice. It was like Simone had never existed. Except she had, and Mira had just proved it. She reopened the Red Seats 001 video one more time and paused it at minute 7. Danielle, seated, the badge resting on her knee. The same expression Simone had once worn, calm, unreadable, aware. That chair had become something more than furniture. It was a memorial, a message, a throne of resistance built by silence. Mira stood and walked over to the board on her office wall. She printed Danielle's image and pinned it beside the only photo she had left of Simone, taken during a training seminar on federal integrity protocols 7 years earlier. Different time, same fire behind the eyes. 2 women, 1 mission, 6 years apart, and now, finally, one investigation to bring them together. By midnight, Mira had filed an emergency audit motion to reopen Simone Archer's record. She included Danielle Mercer's presence as context and attached the Red Seat 001 video as supporting evidence. She knew it wouldn't be approved easily, but it didn't need to be, because now the record existed again. Officially, permanently, and there was no erasing it this time. She paused before logging out, then added a final note to the case summary. The chair Danielle sat in was once Simone Archer's. We missed it the first time. We won't miss it again. The past, scrubbed and silenced, had finally forced its way back into the present. Not with noise, not with violence, but with a seat that was never meant to be empty. It didn't begin with sirens or breaking news. There was no media van outside the courthouse, no headlines screaming corruption, no early morning raids. The change arrived the same way the rot had crept in, quietly. It came as a system message sent at 7:06 a.m. on a Monday, addressed to key personnel within the Grey Ridge Judicial Complex. 2 lines. Cold. Clear. Subject: immediate personnel suspension. Sergeant Caleb Rourke and Deputy Lynn Mallory. Effective immediately. There was no explanation, no pending investigation, no administrative leave. Just a coded signature from the Department of Federal Oversight, stamped with an enforcement seal that could not be appealed or delayed. Within minutes, whispers began to ripple through hallways that had once echoed with forced order. By 7:20 a.m., Rourke's nameplate was removed from his office door. Mallory's locker in the security wing stood open, contents boxed and moved without ceremony. The air in the courthouse, usually buzzing with legal small talk and procedural routine, now felt hollow, like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't name. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The rules had changed, and someone powerful was watching. The veterans were the first to feel it. Men and women who had held rank for over a decade, who used to walk the corridors like soldiers on parade, now walked slower. They avoided eye contact, not just with their superiors, but with each other. Rourke had been more than a colleague. He had been a wall. His presence had shielded years of informal shortcuts, intimidation habits, unchallenged removals. Now that wall had vanished, and behind it, the cracks were showing. In the judge's chambers, things grew quieter. It wasn't fear exactly, more like introspection with a scent of guilt. Files were reopened not because of legal necessity, but because judges began to second-guess what they had once waved through. Some pulled out procedural codes they hadn't studied in years. Others reviewed transcripts of hearings they presided over with new eyes, as if suddenly unsure whether justice had truly been served, or just mimicked. By 9 a.m., 2 court officers removed a camera from courtroom 2, the very room where Danielle Mercer had sat. Not for repairs, for review, internal audit. One officer muttered something about malfunction logs, but no one believed it. Those cameras had worked exactly as intended. They'd failed right when they were supposed to. Not anymore. And though the public didn't yet know what had happened, those on the inside felt the shift with every breath. Court clerks who used to ignore incidents like Rourke's now spoke in hushed tones over lunch, asking, "Did you see the footage? Did you hear about the badge? Was she really DFO?" But Mira Langston didn't answer questions. She didn't issue memos. She didn't attend briefings. She let the system stew in its own quiet panic, because that was the point. The justice system had learned to survive by making noise when it wanted power, and silence when it wanted cover. Now it was learning what it felt like to be silently watched in return, and that silence carried weight. In courtroom 4, a young assistant prosecutor paused mid-trial to double-check jury instructions. Not out of caution, but out of paranoia. What if someone was recording? What if someone filed a report? What if she was sitting in the room again? She wasn't. Danielle Mercer was long gone, but the chair she had occupied remained. Unmoved, unmarked, untouched. A wooden seat in the last row that now held more authority than the bench it faced. And everyone knew it. By noon, 4 internal emails had been circulated. Quiet reminders about use of force protocol, spectator rights, and complaint handling. The language was polite, almost casual, but the message was unmistakable. If you've gotten away with something before, you won't again. In the security wing, silence reigned. Guards who once shared gallows humor with Rourke now walked alone. No one used his name. No one said he didn't mean it. No one defended him. Because in this new atmosphere, even alignment was risk. Mallory's absence struck a different chord. She hadn't been as overt as Rourke, but everyone remembered the way she hovered at the edges of conflict, watching, enabling, never intervening. The kind of complicity that isn't illegal, just deadly to integrity. And now she was gone too. Her badge deactivated, her logins wiped clean, her silence now suspended in the very system that once rewarded it. Even junior staff felt it. Julian Reeve, the quiet clerk who had recorded the video, returned to work that Monday without fanfare. But something in the way people looked at him had changed. They didn't know what he had done, but they knew he had seen. His steps down the hallway no longer felt invisible. And for the first time in 2 years, no one interrupted him when he reviewed transcripts line by line, hunting for inconsistencies others had always ignored. In the cafeteria, conversations shifted. There was no longer casual laughter about tough law enforcement. People spoke less about courtroom victories and more about ethical protocol. Words like procedure and record had become dangerous again. Not for what they justified, but for what they now exposed. And outside the courthouse, still silence. No press conference. No reporter holding a microphone to a trembling witness. But the courthouse itself had become a witness. The reckoning Mira Langston had seeded didn't need press coverage to be effective. Because this change wasn't just administrative, it was psychological. It was in the way staff double-checked door logs before removing someone from a room. It was in how judges paused before denying motions they once dismissed out of habit. It was in the way janitors glanced at courtroom cameras and whispered, "I think it's watching now," because it was. She was. The system was. And once silence had been weaponized by the powerful, now it had turned into their greatest fear. At 3:36 p.m., Mira received a short internal message. "Recommendation for revised officer training submitted to Ethics Division. We're rewriting protocol." She didn't respond. She simply folded the message, printed it, and pinned it on her wall beside Danielle's still frame. Above it, she wrote 3 words. The shift began. And beneath it, smaller, as if just for herself, "No applause required." It began as a whisper, a flicker of footage moving through private channels, sealed listservs, and secure internal forums. No hashtags, no trending tab, no headlines, just a video clip under 5 minutes long, grainy in parts, quiet throughout, and devastating in what it didn't need to say. It showed no raised voices, no chaos, no shouts of protest. Only a woman in a red blazer, seated in the back of a courtroom, refusing to stand, refusing to flinch, refusing to disappear. And somewhere across that silence, the system started to tremble. The clip was titled simply, "Red Seat, Show 1." It first appeared on a judiciary review thread for the Eastern Compliance Circuit, attached without commentary by an anonymous poster. Within hours, it was forwarded to 5 internal ethics committees and 12 oversight divisions across state lines. By the next morning, it was being viewed in federal policy training sessions. Its runtime paused every 30 seconds so facilitators could dissect facial expressions, timing, posture. Not of the accused, but of the institution itself. Stillness had never been studied so closely. In the recording, you could hear the moment Sergeant Caleb Rourke's voice cracked. You could hear the pressure shift in the room as Danielle Mercer revealed her badge without moving more than a single muscle. And you could see it, the way seasoned officers fidgeted, how a deputy turned her shoulder away, how a courtroom built to dominate suddenly looked too small for the truth inside it. This was not a protest. This was a reckoning in slow motion, and it was contagious. The first law school to use the footage was a quiet, mid-sized program in Connecticut. A professor, known more for her Socratic method than her ideology, played the clip without introduction. She turned down the lights, turned up the volume slightly, and let the students watch in silence. No one spoke as the video played. When it ended, she leaned against her desk, crossed her arms, and asked one question. "Do you see disobedience, or do you see a standard being corrected?" The room was still. One student, normally outspoken, looked at the floor and mumbled, "I don't know anymore." That was the beginning. The video began showing up in diversity seminars, not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror. In oversight meetings, junior auditors pushed for it to be added to onboarding materials. At a legal ethics conference in Denver, it played on loop in a breakout room labeled Witness in Plain Sight. And at each screening, the same thing happened. No one interrupted. No one laughed. Some took notes. Others just sat still, mirroring the stillness they were watching. Because in that 5-minute span, the hierarchy of perception flipped. People weren't watching to see if the officer used too much force. They were watching to see why no one stopped him, why no one else stood up, why silence had been the room's default response. And that became the question no classroom could ignore. Some professors added the clip to constitutional law syllabi. Others included it in lessons on courtroom conduct. In a mock trial class in Atlanta, a student jury watched the footage and rendered a unanimous verdict, not against the defendant, but against the institution that allowed the moment to happen. The ripple was no longer confined to the courthouse. It moved through learning spaces, policy meetings, municipal evaluations. The footage became more than evidence. It became curriculum. At a state ethics committee in New Jersey, a chairperson paused the meeting halfway through and said, "We've trained for every kind of disruption, except this." He tapped the printed frame of Danielle sitting, badge open, gaze steady. "This isn't noise. This is what the system looks like when someone refuses to play along." And the silence that followed was not agreement. It was shame. Meanwhile, Mira Langston tracked the view count. Not public clicks, but internal access logs from jurisdictions across the country. By the end of the third week, the video had been shown in 53 legal offices, 28 law schools, and 9 federal ethics briefings. Mira didn't say a word to congratulate herself. She wasn't interested in noise. She was measuring impact by discomfort. And the discomfort was growing. At a federal roundtable in D.C., one judge spoke for the first time after watching the clip, his voice low. "I always thought courtroom decorum was about preserving dignity. But now I wonder whose dignity we've been preserving." In that same session, a young intern raised her hand and asked, what would have happened if she hadn't shown the badge? No one answered, because they all knew the truth. She would have been removed, like Simone Archer, like so many others whose names weren't even written down. That was the real earthquake under the ripple. It wasn't just that Danielle Mercer had forced the system to look at itself. It was that she had revealed how many others had been silenced before her. The badge got her seen. But what about the women who never had one? What about the ones who stood, or spoke, or simply asked the wrong question? The video didn't offer closure. It offered confrontation. It challenged people not with spectacle, but with stillness. And for once, that stillness wasn't interpreted as passivity. It was interpreted as power. In that courtroom, Danielle had done what entire campaigns had failed to do. She disrupted the myth that justice was being served simply because the room was quiet. Her silence said, "You've mistaken order for righteousness. And now I'm showing you the difference." And once people saw it, they couldn't unsee it. By the end of the month, an internal memo circulated through DFO offices. Red Seat Order 1 to be included in Judicial Oversight Recertification. Required viewing. And beneath it, one line in bold. Stillness in the face of systemic momentum is a lawful act of review. Danielle Mercer didn't ask for a platform. She didn't issue a statement. She wasn't profiled in magazines or brought to speak on panels. But the chair she sat in? It became a question posed in every room that saw the footage. A chair no longer defined by silence, but by the courage of a woman who refused to move. Danielle Mercer disappeared the same way she arrived. Without announcement, without fanfare, and without a single word spoken into a microphone. No televised interviews, no social media profiles, no viral survivor label. She walked into a courtroom, sat down, refused to move, and then walked away while the system she had quietly unraveled spent the following weeks trying to put itself back together. There were no awards waiting for her, no plaques etched in her honor, no statue proposals, just echoes, reforms, and the sound of a structure finally learning to breathe differently. The video, Red Seat 01, was still circulating in classrooms and compliance sessions across the country, but Danielle's name was already fading from the conversation, not out of neglect, out of design. Because what she had done wasn't meant to elevate her. It was meant to humble everything around her. And it did. Inside the Department of Federal Oversight, Mira Langston was asked by a journalist during a closed-door ethics briefing why Danielle Mercer had never made a public statement. Why, after all that had unfolded, after footage, fallout, and reform, she had chosen silence over spotlight. Mira didn't hesitate. Her statement was in not leaving. It landed with the kind of gravity no press release could match. Because it was true. Danielle didn't need to speak. because she stayed. While others flinched, backed down, looked away, she sat. And that presence, unbent and unbothered by the theatrics of courtroom control, spoke louder than 100 press conferences ever could. As Mira pinned another progress memo on her office wall, she thought back to that single moment when Danielle had opened her badge case without even raising her head. That small, exact motion had set off a ripple so wide it reached institutions that had gone untouched for decades. 3 weeks after the video first circulated, the Gray Ridge Judicial Review Committee released a quiet internal notice. A permanent subcommittee on courtroom conduct had been formed. Its purpose? To investigate nonverbal procedural coercion, unauthorized removals, and racial bias in real-time enforcement. The language was clinical, dry, but the implication was thunderous. They were finally naming the ghosts, and they weren't stopping there. A set of procedural reform memos began to circulate. Mira recognized the phrasing. She'd helped draft some of the language. Others came from legal scholars who had watched the Red Seat 101 footage on repeat, dissecting its silences like case law. Entire guidelines were rewritten, not with sweeping declarations, but with line-by-line corrections. Words like respectful posture were replaced with right to passive observation. The phrase expected physical response was removed entirely. No one stood at a podium and announced the changes, but people felt them, like the soft but unmistakable shift of a tide turning underfoot. Even the courtroom chairs in Gray Ridge were rearranged. The seat Danielle had occupied was quietly removed for maintenance one afternoon. When it returned, it bore no plaque, no marking, but it now sat an inch further from the wall, in slightly fuller view of the bench. Not symbolic, perhaps, but meaningful. A space once used to minimize presence had been widened. Slightly. Permanently. And that was enough. Because Danielle hadn't acted for recognition. She hadn't tried to immortalize herself. She had simply refused to disappear. And in doing so, she made the system admit who it had failed, and who it could no longer afford to ignore. Across the country, legal departments began adopting new review protocols. Some called them Danielle clauses behind closed doors, short segments buried in larger reform packages that required documented cause for any courtroom removal. Other reforms included mandatory third-party observers in high-risk hearings and anonymized complaint stations placed in courthouse lobbies. None of these changes mentioned her name, but they were because of her. In one internal seminar, a senior federal judge paused after reviewing the Red Seat footage and said, "You know, there used to be this idea that silence in a courtroom meant submission, that if you weren't speaking, you weren't resisting. But now, I see it differently. Now I see silence as scrutiny, as power, as judgment turned inward." Mira, seated in the back of that seminar, allowed herself a rare smile. They were starting to understand. Outside of policy circles, the story faded as quickly as it rose. There were no viral hashtags, no legacy media campaigns. Danielle's face was never printed on posters or quoted in motivational reels. When her name did surface in closed communities, it was usually in whispers, often followed by, "She didn't want credit. She wanted change." And that, Mira thought, was the rarest thing of all. Because we live in a world that demands declarations, that prizes the loudest voice, the boldest brand, the most visible victory. But Danielle Mercer had done the opposite. She didn't demand the system acknowledge her. She forced the system to acknowledge itself, and now it was doing so, quietly, reshaping its own edges with something resembling humility. In Mira's office, a running tracker showed declining rates of unrecorded removals in 7 major courtrooms. The number dropped each week. Small percentages. But it was working. She didn't frame the chart. She didn't post updates. She just watched the line trend downward, steadily, like the descent of something that had finally realized how high it had been floating above consequence. And as the reforms spread, Danielle's absence became its own kind of presence. The kind that lived in policy lines and procedural manuals, in revised training slides and classroom debates, in that chair, that red blazer, that silence. There would never be a monument to her, no statue in front of a courthouse, no building renamed in her honor. But there was something else, something better, a system that now questioned itself. Every time someone sat still, every time someone stayed, every time someone refused to move just because they were told to. Danielle didn't need applause. She left behind something far more powerful: accountability. Years had passed since that quiet Monday when Sergeant Caleb Rourke and Deputy Lynn Mallory were suspended, since Danielle Mercer had taken her seat in the back of the courtroom and altered the rhythm of an entire system. The names involved had faded from memos. The policy shifts, once hotly debated, were now standard operating procedure. Even the footage, Red Seat 01, no longer circulated in as many forums, though its memory still held weight in the minds of those who'd seen it. But in the courthouse at Grey Ridge, the story was never forgotten. It lingered in the air. Not loudly, not as some revered spoken tale, but as a tension, a reverence that didn't quite name itself. It was there in how the guards stood straighter, how clerks double-checked the removal protocols, how the judges paused more carefully before citing decorum as justification for dismissal. And most of all, it remained in that one particular seat. It sat at the far end of the last row. Same polished oak. Same faint scratch on the side leg that, if you looked closely enough, resembled a slash mark. Some thought it had been replaced, but it hadn't. It was the same chair Danielle Mercer had once occupied. The chair Simone Archer had once tried to claim before she was removed and erased. The chair where accountability first made itself visible. And now it was just called the seat. Not officially, of course. No signs pointed to it. No velvet rope guarded it. But everyone in the building knew its story, even if they didn't say her name. One late afternoon, as the courthouse was settling into its end-of-day shuffle, a new intern, fresh from university, crisp shirt, eager eyes, followed a senior clerk into courtroom 2 for orientation. The intern's name was Malik. He was polite, curious, and already planning to go to law school. He asked questions with wide-eyed enthusiasm and jotted down answers like they were gospel. But when they stepped into the courtroom, Malik's steps slowed. The room was quiet, bathed in the soft amber of the evening sun spilling through high windows. Dust floated in the air like fine ash. The benches, empty now, still carried the memory of cases and testimonies and verdicts. He scanned them idly until his eyes landed on the last row, far right. One chair, barely different from the rest, stood out to him. He pointed. "Hey," he said, voice hushed without realizing. "Who sat there?" The clerk stopped mid-step. A man in his late 50s, hair graying around the temples, eyes heavy with decades of work. He looked at the seat and then back at Malik. There was a pause, measured, deliberate. He could have said the name. He could have said Danielle Mercer, or DFO, or Red Seat. But instead, he said something truer. "That," he said, nodding toward the chair, "is where someone sat and made the system look at itself." Malik blinked. Was she a judge? No, the clerk said. She didn't ask for power. She reminded it what power was supposed to be. The words settled over the room like dust, soft but undeniable. Malik turned back to the chair, suddenly seeing it differently. It wasn't marked. It didn't need to be. It had become its own kind of monument. Not to a person, but to a moment, a choice. He sat in it for just a second. Nothing grand happened. No rush of divine wisdom, no trembling vision. But something did shift, internally. A weight, a realization. This chair had once been where resistance was invisible until it became undeniable. It wasn't the chair that mattered. It was what it allowed. A place to stay when everything else told you to go. A space to be still when the world demanded obedience disguised as motion. A reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come from those in robes or behind benches, but from those who sit, silent, in the places everyone else overlooks. Back in Mira Langston's office, now held by her successor, the framed policy amendment still hung on the wall. It read, "All removals must be reviewed, recorded, and justified under Code Section 214B." And beneath it, smaller, "Stillness is not a threat. It is an observation." No one needed to be reminded where the inspiration had come from. But still, when visitors asked, someone would always say, "It came from a chair." In training sessions, new recruits watched the same footage their predecessors had seen years earlier. Some reacted with shame, others with awe, but all of them understood the same lesson. Power isn't what you wield. It's what you answer to when no one else is watching. At a quiet university in Oregon, a law professor asked her students to write reflections on acts of silent defiance. One student wrote, "She never raised her voice. She never pointed her finger. She just stayed. And in doing so, she made everyone else move. No one had to guess who she meant." In the years that followed, more reforms came, subtle at first. Quiet changes to protocol, new reporting channels, enhanced oversight. But beyond the paperwork, something else changed. A culture of watching replaced a culture of turning away. People began to notice things they hadn't before. Questions were asked sooner. Assumptions took longer to form, and while no one ever issued a press release about it, there was one quiet, unofficial rule passed from clerk to clerk, guard to guard, judge to judge. Never underestimate the person sitting alone in the back row, because now they all understood. That chair was never just a chair. It was a choice, a moment, a mirror. And when someone chooses to sit there, they are not small. They are not invisible. They are not powerless. They are watching, and the system watches back. In a country that often celebrates bold speeches and loud protests, this story reminds us that true power doesn't always roar. It sits, it watches, and it waits for the right moment to act. Danielle Mercer never raised her voice, yet her silence forced an entire courtroom, and eventually an entire system, to confront its own corruption. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't need applause. But through her quiet refusal to leave that chair, she exposed a culture of fear, racial bias, and unchecked authority that had been buried for years. The lesson is clear. Change does not always begin with mass movements. It can begin with one person refusing to move. For American citizens, the message is urgent. Your presence matters, your observation matters, and your refusal to look away might be the spark that lights systemic change. Whether you sit in a courtroom, a school board meeting, a town hall, or a quiet corner of your workplace, you have the ability to hold power accountable, not with violence, not with outrage, but with truth and courage. This isn't just about justice reform. It's about redefining what justice looks like when it enters the room. And it starts when we stop walking away. So here's your call to action. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories that inspire real accountability. Like this video if you believe silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Share this with at least one person who needs to be reminded that sitting down can be just as powerful as standing up. Because sometimes 5 minutes of stillness can shake a courtroom. Sometimes one chair in the back row becomes the center of change. And sometimes the quietest person in the room becomes the reason we all rethink what power really is. If you remember anything from this story, remember this. You don't need to be remembered by name to be remembered by impact. What matters is that you begin. Someone else will carry it forward. Thank you for watching. Let the silence continue to speak. And never underestimate what can happen. When someone refuses to leave the chair,